Hi everyone, it's great to see so many people here. My name is Steve. I'm a research fellow at the Digit Centre, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this event today. It's the launch for a policy brief, which is featured on the Digit website, and I guess there will be a link in the chat to that posted shortly, called How Can Local Government Shape the Future of Work in Deindustrialized Regions? And it was written by three Digit members. So I'll introduce them and then they will briefly cover the report. And then we have two guests with us as well. So first of all, for the authors of the report, Abbie Winton is a research fellow at the University of Leeds and part of the Digit Centre. She, in her research, focuses on how technology adoption plays out at the regional level and examines the local ecosystems that shape industrial strategy and the future of work. Charles Umney is Professor of International Work and Employment at Leeds University Business School. His research looks at how market dynamics shape technology and power in the workplace with a focus on digital technologies in warehousing and worker protest in the platform economy. And finally, for the authors, Gabriella Alberti is Professor of International Labour Migration at Leeds University Business School. She co-founded the Leeds Migration Research Network, which brings together researchers and practitioners working on migration and minoritized groups. So we'll hear first from the authors, and then we'll have two responses. First from Tim Page, who is founding director of Industrial Paradigm, a consultancy providing economic research for companies, unions, and trade associations. He previously spent 16 years at the TUC, specializing in industrial energy and innovation policy, and has contributed to documents like Rachel Reeves's Everyday Economy pamphlet and Lord Heseltine's No Stone Unturned report on economic growth. And then finally, we'll hear from Dominic Jones, who is Economic Policy Development Officer at Barnsley Council, where he leads on policies supporting the borough's economic growth and regeneration. So let's first of all hear then from the report authors. So whichever of you wants to go first and share your slides if you have any, please go ahead. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you, Gemma. That looks good. I'm guessing everybody can see that okay, because I can. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so thanks everybody for joining. Today, Charles, Gabriella and myself wanted to present to you some findings from some research that we've done over the past kind of 3 years or so, exploring this question of how local government can shape the future of work in deindustrialised regions. So to do so, we're going to draw on some work that we've recently completed, finally, in December, looking at the use of technology in warehousing. We're going to outline some key findings and then some recommendations that are set out in the Digit policy blog that has been published today. I'm sure you'll get the link. And then offer some reflections on some themes that we might be interested in exploring a bit more kind of in Digit 2 and beyond. Thanks, Gemma. Next slide. So it's probably useful to give a bit of an overview about what motivated this research. And I think we're all aware of kind of debates around the future of work, which emphasize the importance of the role of the state and how these institutions kind of shape the workplace impacts of technology. I mean, there's a vast amount of literature on this. A lot of people working for Digit have written on this. But we really felt that the role of the local state, and by this in the UK context, I mean kind of local and regional authorities, have to some extent been neglected within these discussions. So this also, partly it felt like an important gap because it had been neglected in kind of discussions around the future of work. But it also felt like quite an important gap because increasingly we're seeing colleagues write around how local institutions are attempting to actually play a more progressive regulatory role in kind of local employment systems. So bringing those two together, we were interested in trying to understand what a more progressive role for local government might actually look like in a context of rapid technological acceleration, and consider whether we could actually envisage a future where local actors have more influence over the use of technology in the workplace, and what this actually looks like for local labour markets. Next slide, thanks, Gemma. So, as I mentioned, the work we're presenting today draws on part of a wider project looking at the use of technology and its impact on warehousing work. And this was, again, part of a wider European project with colleagues in Belgium, Germany, and Poland. But our focus within the UK team was primarily on the Yorkshire region, and really not the whole Yorkshire region. I mean, we're pretty much concerned with the area within this kind of red circle on the map. So really the intersection of a few key motorways, a really kind of glamorous area to do field work in. And what we wanted to do was to set out to try and understand how local actors viewed working conditions in the sector and to what extent they tried to influence them. So in order to do this, we did a range of interviews with people involved in the kind of wider ecosystem that surrounded warehousing in the region. So primarily this was made up of people working in local government, so people in the combined and local authorities in roles like inward investment roles, economic development roles, and people with oversight on kind of skills and employment programs, those sorts of things. And we also spoke to a range of kind of regional trade union officials and other people working labour market intermediary roles, so people involved in the provision of employment support programmes, local charities supporting marginalised groups, and so on. So it was a kind of a wide range of people adjacent to warehousing. We didn't actually necessarily set out to focus on local government from the beginning, but when we started doing the early interviews, we felt that local government participants were actually really interested in this question of technological change and what it actually means for the future of work in the region, particularly in relation to warehousing, because it is so significant in this area. So we ended up kind of following this strand of work in much more depth than what we had expected, as is often the case in academic research. Next slide, please, Gemma. So I think it's perhaps quite useful to outline why local government participants were so interested in warehousing in the Yorkshire region. So throughout the past 10 years or so, the number of people working in the sector has really grown quite rapidly. And this has created a situation where in parts of South and West Yorkshire, like Doncaster and Wakefield, warehousing work accounts for over 8% of all employment. So it is becoming a quite significant source of employment. Another thing that's quite significant is that warehousing firms really want to be located in this region because, as you saw on that map, it's well connected, but also because it offers cheaper land and cheaper labour costs than other warehousing hubs in the country, so parts of like South East and the East Midlands. However, why is it potentially a source for concern? As we know from our research in HULOG, but also from other colleagues' kind of previous research on warehousing, we're seeing that the use of technology is becoming more widespread, but it could also have the potential to impact work in relation to job quality, but also the quantity of work available in the sector. So it's not uncommon for warehousing work or digitalised warehousing work to be associated with issues that we all know, like surveillance, intensification, different forms of control, deskilling, and so on. And in our research, the working conditions in warehousing in Yorkshire are really quite varied. In some of the cases, we saw work was highly monitored. People were paid according to like bonuses depending on how fast they picked. In some of the worst cases, whereas in other cases, work was actually relatively high paid for the type of work. There were good relationships with trade unions and negotiations over the implementation of technology. So it really did vary quite significantly case to case in terms of the working conditions. However, and like the working conditions, the use of technology also varied quite significantly between firms. So Some of the warehouses we visited were highly automated. They used robots and conveyors to kind of move products around the shop floor. I'm sure we've all seen pictures of that, to largely stationary workers. So people stood next to a conveyor at a kind of station. Whereas other warehouses we went to, they relied primarily on kind of manual trolleys, forklift trucks, and so on. So it was still a lot of kind of manual labour required. As far as we understood it, because of this variance, there was really little any kind of evidence of mass job replacement taking place. But because the sector had rapidly grown over the past few years, it's quite hard to understand what's going on, because it could be the case that some of the job replacements actually being obscured by the rapid growth of the sector. And of course, we could see more automation in the sector going forward. This is just a kind of a snapshot in time. Thanks, Gemma. So a lot of these issues were reflected in the interviews that we conducted with local stakeholders. So on the whole, they really did feel like the future of work in the sector remained really uncertain. And this was particularly driven by the fact that they found it quite hard to get information from large local employers about their future plans. And Charles is going to touch on this a bit more in a minute. So on the one hand, they were concerned about a potential future scenario where much of the work in warehousing was automated. And I think this was felt particularly strongly in Yorkshire because this kind of reflected historical anxieties around the rapid loss of industries like mining and manufacturing. So the local state was much more cautious about relying on one sector that could potentially one day require far fewer workers. They were also concerned about the potential for a fewer but better jobs future in the sector. So say if there was a scenario where the number of warehousing jobs fell, but those that remained were more highly skilled in areas like engineering, there were concerns that the local skills base wouldn't necessarily be able to meet these new demands. And we'd see a situation where outsiders would come into the region and get these jobs, basically. So this left a situation where local authorities, combined authorities, had reservations about the future of warehousing in the region, but often they were still in a position where they needed to embrace warehousing because of the influx of work that it offered. Charles, can I hand over to you for the next couple of slides?
Sure. Yeah. So in this context, what we wanted to do with this study was start to identify this kind of taxonomy, if you like, of three different ways in which people within local state, local authorities, devolved government were trying to kind of mediate the relationship between technological change and work in warehousing. You know, what were the things that they could do and were doing to try and ensure that as the warehousing industry evolved technologically, they would sort of trying to improve outcomes for workers, for local workers in that process. And I think we want to argue that actually the taxonomy we came up with is probably relevant beyond warehousing. It's derived from our study of warehousing, but we think it's relevant beyond that because these are relatively general categories. Now, we're not talking here about direct influence over tech adoption. You know, local authorities clearly are not generally dictating to sort of warehousing firms what kind of tech they should be using, clearly. But rather, we're talking here about kind of more indirect strategies where local government seeks to influence the choices employers make in a context of technological change. So I'm just going to talk through these three strategies now briefly, and we present them in kind of order from the softest to the strongest. In other words, by softest here, don't necessarily mean that in a pejorative way, but simply that it's more reliant on kind of gently nudging employer choices as opposed to harder methods like kind of more concrete regulation. But all of these strategies, to a large extent, remain predominantly voluntaristic. They remain reliant on kind of buy-in and decisions freely made by employers. Next slide, please, Megan. So the first of these is what we've called engagement and advocacy. Essentially, we mean efforts by local state actors to build ongoing relationships with firms to better understand technological trajectories in those industries and to promote priorities that might be beneficial to local workers in that process. This reflects probably what Bricken and Taylor referred to as the brokerage role of the state. In other words, where kind of local authorities have this role in kind of mediating, negotiating inward investment, encouraging people to invest, to set up in their areas, but also engaging them in kind of dialogue to talk about the conditions under which that might take place. Good examples here might be from the warehousing industry. Things like hosting recruitment days for local warehousing firms to try and improve or build relationships between warehousing employers and local authorities, with the aim of ultimately trying to alleviate information asymmetries about technological usage and future work opportunities. In other words, as Abbie said, a lot of local government actors are worried about what technological change could mean for the future of warehousing work. Can they use these kind of engagement strategies to build links, build dialogue to understand where things are going and how they can adapt? This is what we mean by engagement and advocacy. Generally, however, these kind of relationships were often very modest in warehousing, right? We suspect they might be stronger in other sectors, but we can only speculate on that today. But in warehousing, they were quite hard to sustain. Firms were often prepared to engage with local authorities on their own terms, but without necessarily making that much information available, which is a real challenge for actually having really effective initiatives like this around kind of information sharing. The warehousing industry remains a bit of a black box, we think, for a lot of local authority interviewees. And this also meant that initiatives like charters, sort of fair work charters, where companies sign up to a set of expectations around good working conditions, limiting 0 hours contracts, paying the living wage, things like this, they were relatively limited effectiveness because often it's just very hard to tell what warehousing employers are doing. Next slide, please, Megan. They're quite opaque. The second one is what we've called activation strategies, which basically refers to local states trying to influence the firms decisions make about recruitment and also to leverage kind of technologically routinized jobs as a sort of accessible route into employment for marginalized groups. Now, this is really interesting. There's a lot to say about it. And to some extent, I think this could be contested or challenging for reasons which we don't have that much time to go into, because they raise questions about sort of labour market inequalities and the risk of reinforcing them. But we have various examples where technology essentially made warehousing work more accessible. So that could mean it makes it less physically demanding through kind of conveyor or robotic systems, and also very frequently less kind of mentally difficult. In other words, the job becomes more routinized, more repetitive, where the worker is following through a very, very rigidly prescribed set of actions. They're not being allowed to really make many decisions. And we had a number of cases where respondents would say, actually, this is an opportunity. Warehousing is an opportunity to get marginalized groups into warehousing work. Certain categories of worker who might be difficult to place or to support into work might thrive more in an environment where the labor process is more routinized and more repetitive, for example. Or people with limited English language skills might find it easier to be in this environment where essentially you're just kind of following a set of computerized instructions around without any real sort of communication with other workers. So we did find these kinds of accounts. And you can see why this is important for a lot of local authorities, particularly in a context where they're experiencing immense political and financial pressure to reduce kind of welfare bills, to push people into work. But it also poses challenges and risks because, we can quickly see that there's a risk that jobs like warehousing become perceived as sort of a relatively easy place in which to place kind of vulnerable populations, which could potentially reproduce kind of inequalities in labour markets. So this is a very complex issue, but it was another way in which local authorities sought to leverage technological change in warehousing in a way that they felt could work to benefit their local populations. Next slide, please, Megan. And finally, what we might call the kind of hardest, if you like, of these three strategies, because it theoretically is about putting the most direct obligations on employers. By conditionality, we mean basically attempts by local government to make access to public support conditional on commitments to more positive uses of technology which support positive outcomes for workers. Now, there's actually an emerging literature on this. If we look, for example, in the industrial relations literature on conditionality, so local governments might, for instance, put requirements about working conditions into their procurement strategies, where will only source from particular providers if they meet XYZ conditions on sort of worker well-being. So this is actually something that there's a kind of promising discussion around in the wider literature. There weren't really evidence of this happening specifically in warehousing in our data. But what we did start to see was some limited, like relatively small scale attempts to make things like business support and grant funding conditional on meeting kind of outcomes for workers. For example, we might only provide support to strategically important types of business, which are considered to have better, sort of more benign, more promising labour market effects, more potential to upskill people, for instance. However, how this was defined was often very loose. This is a strategy that could help kind of leveraging firms to make commitments. For example, if firms are seeking support to introduce technological initiatives in their workplace, they're looking for counsel advice or funding on that. Could these be linked to targets around ensuring upskilling for workers or limiting job loss? If such a thing were to happen on a higher scale, however, it would really need to be coordinated regionally or nationally, because there was a real fear of individual councils sort of putting their neck on the line, placing requirements on employers when they felt they were competing against other areas to attract investment. So there was a lot of, to an extent, people felt their hands were tied with these kind of strategies because of kind of interregional competition. Anyway, I'll hand back to Abbie in the next slide.
Thanks. So yeah, I guess this was all primary motivation for our policy briefing. This is a shameless plug for the paper that we wrote on this. So some of the bits that Charles said he wanted to expand on but couldn't. It is published in Work and Occupation, so you can go and have a look at that if you'd liked. So once we put all of this research together, we wanted to take our findings back to local government in a workshop environment to try and discuss our findings and some potential recommendations for how they might strengthen their response to some of these challenges going forward. Sorry, Gemma, can I have the next slide, please? So this is what we discuss in the policy briefing, where we kind of reflect on what else can local government actors do in order to positively influence the future of work in warehousing, but also in other large sectors that are vulnerable to technological change kind of within the region. And I think it's worth offering another caveat, as Charles has kind of already done. These recommendations, we acknowledge that local government work in kind of highly constrained conditions. They've been subject to huge budget cuts, which has limited their capacity, and they do have restricted powers still, despite kind of expanded processes of devolution. So we wanted to think about, even without kind of significant regulatory change at the national level, what could local governments still have scope to do, even if it does kind of feel like baby steps. So the first area that Charles has already touched on at the end of, I guess, our findings for the paper was was integrating issues of job quality into the business support provision. So as Charles mentioned, there is already kind of a framework for doing this. So grants are allocated based on the extent to which businesses are considered strategically important in relation to how many jobs they create within the local area. As it stands, kind of local government commits quite a significant amount of funding to businesses to support them with things like technological upgrading. And it was our view that the conditions placed on local businesses could be slightly stricter. So around issues like job quality, like skills development and progression, as Charles mentioned. But there was a slight hesitancy of doing this because if individual local authorities implemented this, then there was a feeling that businesses would just move to a neighbouring local authority that had kind of less harsh conditionality on their grant funding offer. So as Charles mentioned, this would have to be coordinated at the combined authority level, ideally, or potentially the national level as well. The second recommendation is around what we've called establishing multi-stakeholder technology boards. So we envisage these as spaces where we can encourage better dialogue over issues related to technology and technological change at work that should involve local governments, trade unions, community organisations, local businesses, and kind of others in that wider ecosystem. And the idea is that this helps better inform longer term decision making around skills and around workforce planning. And it should reduce some of the information asymmetries that Charles was talking about before, which are really posing a barrier to any kind of longer term planning. And I do appreciate that that's maybe not a particularly new idea. We saw some of these in the 80s, and I know today that some similar arrangements like this do exist, but they need to be kind of more widely institutionalized given the kind of current acceleration of technology. And I suspect Dominic might want to touch on similar themes to this with current pilots that are going on. I feel like we might see more of these in the future. And then the third point was around integrating issues related to technology into employment charters. So particularly in the north of England, we're seeing employment charters being established in regions across the country as a response to local authorities not being able to kind of set local employment regulations. Of course, these are voluntaristic, as Charles has mentioned, and they do come with certain challenges. But in order to kind of ask for more, I guess, to uplift these in a context of rapid technological change, we might envisage a situation where charters also require things like worker consultation on technology implementation in order to try and mitigate some of these more damaging effects. So I guess these are the small tweaks that we came up with through discussions with local authorities based on the research. But we also wanted to think about I guess more broadly, what steps are needed to help local communities navigate the consequences of technological change in a kind of expanded, more progressive role. Gemma, next slide, please. So here we outline 4 things that we thought that we might want to consider going forward. And it would be great to discuss these as a group, actually, and to kind of think whether we think these things are feasible. So the first is we'd like to see a better resourcing and coordination of regional industrial plans. And what I mean by this is that we want to get regions into a position where they can more proactively shape their economic futures rather than just having to react to shocks or respond to what capital and big businesses are doing. So obviously the central government's recently published its modern industrial strategy that claims to want to accelerate growth in deindustrialized regions. So it seems like the time to be having these conversations, hence inviting Tim. But really, some of the current schemes that are being rolled out are quite disjointed, and I think there needs to be some more joined up thinking about how can we empower local authorities, combined authorities, to have a greater say in this kind of national strategy. The second point is around a greater mandate for decentralised economic leadership over employment issues. So in practice, this might look like the greater devolution of powers, and funding, of course, needs to come with devolution, for local skills and employment support programmes that can actually enable more tailored local interventions, and involve a bigger range of stakeholders. So we might be looking at creating multi-agency partnership around issues related to skills and so on. Again, I imagine things like that do exist, but it's really patchy across different regions, and seeing this happen across the board is something we should be working towards. The third thing is greater government oversight over land use and inward investment. And this is something that came directly from our interviews, where local government stakeholders basically explained that they have very little control over the types of employers that were coming to the region because of the way land is allocated, basically. This created a situation where it was quite difficult to steer investment towards or away from less desirable sectors towards sectors that they viewed as more desirable. So they always use the example of they want advanced manufacturing, but they can't stop warehousing for coming to the region because of the way land is classified and so on. So there was cases where Amazon had acquired pieces of land before they'd even known about it. So giving local government more of a say from early on could potentially help with this. And then the final thing was around ensuring increased involvement in industrial relations actors in the local economic policy making process. And I'm hoping that Tim might be able to talk a bit more about this, but ideally we would see a more systematic incorporation of worker voices in shaping kind of the creation of local industrial strategies to ensure that these policies actually align with the needs of local communities, and again better inform this kind of longer term approach to workforce and skills planning, as we've mentioned. So these are all just kind of some quite speculative thoughts, and I really do want to encourage the audience to share thoughts about whether there's things that you're seeing that are working well, whether you think there's kind of barriers that need to be removed in order to improve kind of engagement on some of these issues. And I'm sure our discussants will probably have some thoughts on this. So to conclude, I think the final slide, please, Gemma. This, I think, feels like the right time to be having these conversations, to think more about how local government can be better empowered to do more and to have a positive influence on the future of work, particularly with the windows of opportunities presented by devolution, single settlement agreements, the government's modern industrial strategy, which kind of emphasises the importance of the regions and cities, and also the local government elections coming up in May. So there's a lot going on. I think it's an exciting time to be looking at local government. And really, there is a lot of good stuff happening already. So at the West Yorkshire level, we are seeing some indication of this kind of multi-stakeholder approach through the development of their local economic development plans, where they've incorporated voices from academia and business, and also with the kind of recent announcement of new schemes like the UK Tech Towns pilot that's being rolled out in Barnsley, that again draws on this kind of greater diversity of voices in the kind of informing of local economic policy. So there really is clearly a lot more attention from local government around issues related to technological change. But the only concern, I guess, that remains is quite often we see a focus on the digital and tech sectors. And this is great. The plans are ambitious. They want to attract inward investment and develop kind of skills plans to support this. But I guess there also remains a concern around what the future holds for sectors like warehousing, but others, obviously, that continue to employ large portions of the local population, but are potentially sometimes overlooked in favour of sectors with like a higher growth potential. So I'm going to finish there, I think, before my voice gives out. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from our discussants and the audience. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much to Abbie and Charles for your presentation. And now we can hand over to Tim for about 10 minutes if you'd like to offer your thoughts and comments.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks and congratulations, actually, Abbie, and to the other authors on what looks like a really interesting and important project. I won't kind of introduce myself again because that was done at the start, and I know that time is limited. I'll say something about good work. I'll start by saying something about good work, which is obviously germane to this discussion. Danny Roderick, who is Professor of Economics at Harvard, in an interview with the Financial Times in February 2021, said, "We are in a chronic state of shortage of good jobs." And what he kind of means by that is that in the 60s and the 70s, in the US, but also in the UK, we had hundreds of thousands of working class people in manufacturing, in aerospace and in defense and in motor manufacturing. And these provided good jobs, well-paid jobs to non-graduates from working class communities. And many of those jobs have largely hollowed out in the last half a century. That's partly because of the rise of China and the moving of the center of gravity of manufacturing to the east, but it's also partly due to technology. It's important to understand that technology sometimes helps to create jobs rather than destroy jobs. So at the turn of the 20th century, with the so-called second industrial revolution that led to widespread electricity, Henry Ford used that to create the production line, and that created thousands of jobs for painters and welders and all kinds of people working in motor manufacturing. In the 1970s, when robots came along, all those jobs disappeared because all of that work was done by robots instead. But it's a nice example of how technology, sometimes works for job creation and sometimes works against job creation. Because so many jobs have been lost, that creates a fear among working people. And, Abbie mentioned it. The fear of in a community like Yorkshire, which saw the closure of the coal mines, people there's a kind of mistrust in that the political process can help to create these jobs, and we see this in other areas. So there are some in the trade union movement who they're not opposed to the green agenda, but they're nervous about the green agenda because they're told that with the loss of fossil fuel jobs, we'll see a big growth in green jobs, and they don't see the evidence too often for where those jobs are going to come from. And you often hear trade union leaders say things like, "We're not going to be the miners of the 2020s." So this fear is real, and it's important to recognize it. What is a good job? Well, Danny Roderick, who I mentioned earlier, in his recent book, Shared Prosperity in a Fractured World, says good jobs are easier to recognize than to define. In general terms, we can say that they are jobs that are secure and pay sufficiently well to enable a middle class standard of living, that's middle class in the US sense of the word, or provide a career ladder that leads up to it. They come with labor rights like safe working conditions, collective bargaining, safeguard against arbitrary dismissal, and possibilities of self-advancement. And what's interesting from the perspective of this work on warehousing is that when asked where will the good jobs come from, Danny Roderick doesn't talk about a return to manufacturing. I mean, we would all like to see that, but he argues that there will be manufacturing will be important in the future, but actually employment will expand in occupations. He lists health and personal care, cooks, stockers, order fillers. These jobs do not require a college degree, and they are currently low wage. So a lot of good jobs are going to not come in the obvious areas that we think of good jobs, but for those without a further or higher education and at currently low wage jobs. Now, you mentioned in the introduction that in 2019, I worked with Rachel Reeves, who was then a backbench MP, to produce a report called The Everyday Economy. And this report says the everyday economy is made up of the services, production, consumption, social goods that sustain all our daily lives. Its activities include transport, childcare, health, social care, education, utilities, broadband, social benefits, and the low productivity, low wage sectors of hospitality, retail, food processing, and supermarkets. It is made up of the public, private, and social sectors and is distributed across all regions of the country. And warehousing kind of falls within this area of the everyday economy. It's sometimes known as the foundational economy, and there's a clear overlap between Roderick's identification of future high occupation sectors and the everyday economy as described by Rachel Reeves. Now, Rachel Reeves has said little about the everyday economy since becoming Chancellor, because the emphasis is obviously on growth as quickly as that can be achieved. And so the focus has been on the 8 sectors identified by the industrial strategy, of which the low pay, low productivity sectors are not among them. But this need not be an either or. My most recent report that I produced for my company called Defending the Nation, Growing the Economy. And this looks at how the government's proposed increase in defence spending can be used in such a way that it creates good jobs in industrial communities. And for this report, I interviewed Andy Haldane, who is the former chief economist of the Bank of England. And he told me, in some ways, the bigger point I'd make is that as well as getting 4 square behind your winning sectors, the 8 sectors identified in the white paper, that is not a reason for not investing significantly in what is sometimes called the foundational economy, which is currently the repository of too many of those not good jobs, insecure, low pay, and that you need if you're to have a properly inclusive growth and industrial strategy. So to combine a top-down sectoral approach with a bottom-up skills approach was his argument. So there is a lot of talk about good jobs and not, good jobs in the kind of low pay, low productivity sector and how to make them better jobs. So how to create more good jobs? Well, you'd expect me to say this, but firstly, encourage trade union recognition. Now, most local authorities do recognise unions, but trade union members enjoy better pay and better conditions than non-union members. This is known as the union wage premium. And evidence from the US and the UK show a union wage premium of between 10% and 15%, according to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. The second thing to do, and Abbie mentioned this towards the end, is engage unions in regional economic strategies. I mean, in fact, union engagement in these strategies has been quite low recently. They are engaged, they are involved in initiatives like the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, advocating for good jobs in the region, and that's really, really important. They might be less engaged than otherwise because of capacity issues. They're pulled in too many different directions. But it might be also that they feel confident that they can speak about employment rights, but less confident that they can speak about economic strategy. Because frankly, union officials, someone who went to work in a factory, left school at 16, inevitably is not likely to feel that they have the confidence to engage in, board level discussions with business leaders and others. So there's an interesting initiative between SOAS, the University of London, and the General Federation of Trade Unions, which offers economic education to trade union members. And at the time of its launch, Gawain Little, the General Secretary of the GFTU, said, for far too long, economics education has been neglected by the trade union movement, and this has weakened unions industrially and politically. So this offers training in economic and education in economics to union reps at all different levels. And I think that might be quite an exciting initiative that would be good to see become bigger across the country. Unions have been engaged in developing agreements on the introduction of digital technology. In fact, unions are thinking a lot about this. So the last one initiative that I was involved in just before the pandemic in 2020, just before I left the TUC, was the EU framework agreement on digitalisation, and you can find this online. And this was employers, representatives across the EU, including small business and local government employers, and trade unions across the EU coming together to negotiate how digital technology might be introduced in the workplace. Like all negotiations, it was quite tough, and sometimes we argued over individual words. But this is an area where some thinking has been done between unions and employers, including local government, on this issue. And whilst, of course, an EU framework agreement no longer applies to the UK, it's a nice example of the big issues that have been discussed. So 2 issues that came up were the so-called human in control principle and the risk of surveillance. So the framework agreement says the control of humans over machines and artificial intelligence should be guaranteed in the workplace. It should underpin the use of robotics and AI applications while respecting and complying with safety and security controls. In other words, unions want to know, workers want to know that decisions about their work and their the wider environment in which they operate, these are decisions that are taken by humans and not taken by algorithms. And that's quite important. And it also talks about surveillance, the risk of AI systems being used to, oh, I nearly used the word snoop, but, in surveillance of workers, which again, can undermine their dignity and undermine their working conditions. So again, things like this need to be discussed and considered if AI is being introduced in the workplace. But what didn't happen was that unions said, we don't want technology. They didn't say we don't. They all recognize the value of AI, the value of digital technology and what it brings in a whole host of areas. It's the way the technology is introduced and the way that it's managed that's the issue. The final thing I'll say is about what Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, two economists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, call machine usefulness. Digital technology should not be used to replace workers, but they should be introduced to assist workers. And Acemoglu and Johnson have called this machine usefulness. And so they say that machines could be used to increase worker productivity in tasks that they are already performing, for example, by creating new tasks for workers. And as we saw with the example of the production line, sometimes technology creates new tasks for workers by providing accurate information that can be harnessed by worker creativity and by bringing people with different insights together. These are all things that machines can help us to do so that humans are better in the workplace rather than being replaced by workers. So I was going to leave it there. I mean, Abbie mentioned at the end something around the devolution of economic policy, and I think that would there's some Rachel Reeves mentioned in a speech last week that she's thinking about devolving taxation. I mean, obviously the UK is quite backward when it comes to devolution compared to other countries, so that's quite a bold move. I would say that with regional economic strategies, you need the right institutions because the UK hasn't had the right. I say this as someone who worked for a LEP, but I think there's kind of general understanding that the structure of LEPs, the way LEPs were introduced, what they were asked to do, wasn't with one or two exceptions, wasn't particularly effective. In Solihull, they worked because they were led by Andy Street, who was an experienced business leader, and he knew how to make these institutions work. But too often they didn't deliver. So thinking about economic institutions, that can't be an afterthought. We need to think about how they're structured and how we bring the right people on board if they are to work. I hope those thoughts are useful to the discussion, and I look forward to contributing a little more as the meeting goes on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks for keeping to time too. And then finally, we'll hear from Dominic. So please go ahead, another 10 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and it's really great to be here today. I'd just like to start by saying why this is really relevant for people in Barnsley and for the economy. So we're a catching up economy in Barnsley. We suffer greatly from the effects of deindustrialisation, the closure of the mine industry. You had 30,000 people employed locally. It was a job for life. It was a good job. People worked hard and they earned a good wage. And that was ripped out of our communities. And what the economy has essentially been replaced by is jobs in logistics sector. So this research is really important. But as has been mentioned in the contributions so far, these sectors are having to adapt, they're having to innovate and use technology in ways that will also have implications for the local economy. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Every, who are a major employer in Barnsley. They employ almost 1,500 people, and they have their European logistics hub in Barnsley, just by Junction 36 on the M1, using lots of fantastic, innovative ways of technology, but importantly, employing local people. Now, what they're saying to us in the council and to partners is that they are considering the use of humanoid robots within the next 3 to 5 years. Now, that really makes you sit up and think, doesn't it, around the possibilities and the implications of that. So just thought I'd leave that thought there. And whilst it will have major implications for productivity, it will also have major implications for our economy. But some opportunities, as has been mentioned. So just thought I'd pick up on some of the points that's been made in the research, which, like I say, is a really important piece of work for looking a bit deeper into kind of the role of local government and the wider use of technology in various sectors. So the big point around local government playing an important role in shaping and supporting labour markets to benefit their economies is something that we passionately believe in at Barnsley Council. For the past 30 years, we have aimed to essentially do that because of market failure. And really try to steer the economy to generate the growth, to build a place where people can have a good job, people can have a good home, people can live a good life. But one of the ways that we've done that is through, as has been mentioned before, industrial strategies, local growth strategies, whatever you want to call them. So we've recently announced our Barnsley Inclusive Economic Growth Strategy. So it's going to run from 2025 to 2030. And that's essentially our vision to grow a larger, more diverse and higher value economy where we can attract that investment and support residents to either get good work or start their own business. And it's around that framework for future growth. So looking at where we want to focus our efforts and where do we want to go in the future. So a really important opportunity. So we're really fortunate. We've been recognised by the Centre for Cities in their Cities Outlook report to have had very good growth as one of the top 11 performers towns and cities in the country, with an average income growth of 5.6%, which is double what the rest of the country was at 2.4%. So that's between 2013 and 2023. And that's great, but we want to think about the future. So our strategy focuses on economy, people and place, but also some transformative growth missions. So the first one is to establish Barnsley as the UK's leading digital town. You'll see on my background here some nice shiny things. These are the 3 Yorkshire roses that are the landmark of our SEAM digital campus, opened just last week. There's also the mission to future-proof our manufacturing and logistics base, really important. So the transport and storage subsection makes up for 6.5% of jobs in Barnsley, and manufacturing makes up for about 15%. So a big significant chunk of our economy. And our third mission is to empower all of our communities to thrive. So that's essentially us as the local government bringing together stakeholders, working through our inclusive economy board. It's been mentioned about the role of partnerships. We've got major employers on there. We've got public sector partners. We've got the college, but we've also got charity and volunteer sector partners like the Caulfield Regeneration Trust on there, working together to think about our economy and how we build that in more of an inclusive way. So absolutely agree with that in the research. Really interesting that the research has picked up around some of the concerns about jobs and technology in warehousing. So as I've mentioned before, our growth in Barnsley has very much been powered by the growth of the warehousing and logistics sector, and that's come about as our strategic decision to open up some of the Greenbelt land and some of the strategic lands around, particularly around Junction 36 and 37, around the M1. But we are noticing some trends whereby we had a peak of 7,400 jobs in 2022, and we are noticing that there has been a little bit of a decline. So we're now down 18% from 2023 from 2024 jobs. So it will be interesting to kind of recognise that, and I know that's been picked up in some of the contributions today. But we know that there are opportunities for the economy, potentially for increased efficiency and productivity, reduced costs and reduced carbon emissions. But there's also implications for the workers as well. Higher skilled jobs, better innovation, opportunities for businesses to embrace new technologies and processes so that they can grow, that they can stay agile, and that they can lead developments. And that point's really important to our mission to future-proof these sectors, because they are really important. So part of that is having a provision of a really accessible and upskilling and reskilling opportunities. And that links to our Pathways to Work model, the innovative approach to addressing economic inactivity. And we've informed government thinking on this. We had an expert panel of commissioners led by Alan Milburn, the previous health secretary, really thinking about how can those that are economically inactive be connected to the labour market. So there's working with businesses, working with larger employers, particularly in the logistics sector, actually, they've been working really well. So these kind of cauldron of opportunities and problems are things that we're actively thinking about in local government. And just finally, picking up on the kind of recommendations, if you like, in local government, certainly at Barnsley, we're really interested in the so what, the kind of what can we do, how can we use that. I would absolutely agree around how local government can use some of the tools, integrating some of the issues around work into business support. So we have a fantastic business support arm called Enterprise in Barnsley, award winning, and they've essentially pivoted to focus on the priorities in our inclusive economic growth strategy, but also working with sectors where there are major challenges as well. So we've recently announced business rate relief for businesses in retail, hospitality, and leisure. That's about 750 businesses. So they're very much working with that and plugged into the pathways to work. But one of the main reasons I'm here today, and one that has been mentioned, is around we've been chosen by the UK government as the UK's first tech town. Announced early February by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Now, this is a really innovative pilot, and it's focused around the pillars of acceleration, preparedness, as well as community leadership. So essentially allowing businesses, allowing public sector organisations to get ahead of the curve, but also thinking about upskilling and also importantly thinking about the voices of communities as well. So we've got a few priority projects within that. AI business, adoption and innovation, thinking about our AI campus. You can see the SEAM Digital Campus will be a big part of that, including a possible future for a national centre for digital technologies. Projects including AI upskilling, an AI academy, and AI health innovation. So we've already set up a local reference group. We've got both of the universities, Sheffield Hallam University and the University of Sheffield. We're already reaching out to Imperial College to look at some of the research possibilities, but also really important local anchor institutions, the likes of Barnsley Hospital, the Barnsley CVS, as well as national government. And the momentum.
Oh, no.
Looks like we may have lost Dominic there.
Yeah, I'll
Oh,
message
are
him.
you back, Dominic? You
I'm
froze
back.
briefly. Okay.
back. Is this working?
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
hear you now.
Brilliant. I was just saying that this is a fantastic opportunity to show how tech can be used in areas like Barnsley. So already we've seen 2 pilots announced. We've announced a living lab in partnership with Cisco at the hospital to transform patient care and administration, and also £800,000 AI upskilling fund. So we're on a real journey with the government, and it's really, really exciting for what that could hold for businesses, public sector organisation, and importantly, skills and the community as well. So real opportunities within this report. It raises a lot that we've been seeing on the ground. We know some of the main principles around being proactive rather than reactive, around partnership working with stakeholders. And importantly, we do see digital and tech as cross-cutting, not a sector in of itself, but also the way that economies, the way that public services are going to operate for many, many years to come. So what we're trying to do in Barnsley is essentially ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and we're ahead of the curve rather than being left behind. So I'm looking forward to any questions that you have. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to share some thoughts today.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dominic, and thanks again to all the speakers. We have a bit of time, about 30 minutes or so for discussion. So if people would like, if you want to turn your camera on, you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you don't want to ask it, then you can put it in the chat, and I'm happy to put it to the panel as well. So feel free to chip in. So maybe while we wait for people to gather their thoughts and to put questions together, I can ask a bit more about the practicalities of the research. Could you tell us how you got access to interviewees, who you spoke with, and what that process looked like? Any of the researchers?
Yeah, of course. It's tricky as always. I mean, Tim will know, having done a PhD and other people in the room, but we found warehouse is really hard actually to access, and I think that really reflected the experience of some people that we spoke to in local government as well. They're kind of these grey boxes that sometimes you don't know what's going on inside. Obviously, there's a few outliers. Dominic's already mentioned their good relationship with Every. So yeah, we had to try many different routes to get people to speak to us. Some going through kind of higher level management, others like contacting workers through trade unions and so on. So we managed to cobble together 3 case studies by the end, but there were some sticky times as we went through the process. Then we did obviously a series of interviews with regional trade unions. So Unite was a partner on the HULOG project, so they'd already committed to speak to us. They had to. And we were very, very lucky to speak to a lot of people in local government. And that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning, that we were surprised about how interested they were. And I think they were willing to talk to us because they could see the value of the research and it was something that they were kind of struggling with. So I think that kind of acted as quite a good open door to do quite a significant program of interviews with people like working in local government, kind of with the promise that at the end we can come back to them with some findings that hopefully that they would find useful, as kind of Dominic's talked about a bit today. So yeah, Steve, it was a hodgepodge of of trying to get access, but we got there eventually. I don't know if others have anything they want to add. No.
No. I think you've answered that really well. I think that's fine. Let's see, there's some questions now, so we can hand over.
Yeah, so we can take 2 at a time maybe because they may relate to one another. So we have a question from Irina and then a question from Denise. So if you just want to briefly say hi and who you are and then ask your question, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, hello. I'm Irina Grigoulis. I'm Professor of Work and Skills at the University of Leeds. I mean, brilliant presentation, brilliant research project, really interesting, really important area. I mean, the concern I have is local government have such little power, such little power. Is the answer more devolution across the board so that local government have more power? Is the answer that central government should also do something to assist with this? And if so, what would that look like?
Thanks very much. And Denise?
Hi everyone, just realised how to make my name and to unmute. It's my first time using Zoom. I'm normally on Teams. So I'm Denise Shepherd. I'm with the University of Salford, first year doing my PhD. I'm one of the reasons why I was interested in this particular seminar debate today was because you were looking at local government, and I'm in the process of making arrangements to connect with local government. So my question is kind of purely from a really personal basis. I've got some buy-in from 2 local authorities, but I think there is some concern about how the information that might come out of the research is disseminated and whether that reflects poorly on them as political organisations. And I don't know whether you came across any of those concerns and how you address them.
Thanks very much. So we can go around the panel. And just a reminder for the next round, Gemma's left some helpful instructions, which I forgot to give, about how to raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand, you can click on the heart button on the bottom of your screen. You'll see a reactions tab, and the option is in there. So shall we go to the authors first, and then the discussants, if they have anything to add to these questions?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak very briefly. Yeah, Irina's question, what should central government be doing? Very important question. And for me, central government should be setting a framework which enables local government to pursue some of the strategies we've been talking about today, because that's often very difficult for local authorities. Like if they want to say, for instance, we want to make business support conditional on particular sort of policies around quality of work, for instance, it's extremely difficult for them to do that because of kind of interregional competition. Well, if we do that, then another authority, someone else, somewhere down the road will get the investment instead. So I think in an ideal world, I'd like to see central government sort of coordinating these issues a lot more so that local authorities aren't kind of out on their own to the same extent. We know that there's potentially a sort of more extensive kind of fiscal devolution agenda coming down the line, but we don't really know what that means at this stage. So it's hard to say exactly what the future will mean about the sort of financial side. Denise's question, yeah, I think in our case, because we were talking to them about technology, it creates a lot of kind of willingness to talk, actually. So when I've been involved in projects before, which have had other focus, I do find it harder to get participants in the field to agree to talk to us. I think generally people are interested and want to talk about technology. Obviously, having said all that, we have been really careful about kind of anonymization. We're not naming any of the authorities we're talking to about or any of the people we spoke to. I don't think we're saying anything that's sort of particularly critical or could reflect badly on them in this talk. So I don't think the issues aren't really there in that sense. But of course, just in case, we have been really careful with anonymity. But I think in answer to your question, the reason we found this not too difficult getting participation from kind of local government, for instance, was because we're talking about technology and people are really interested to talk about that. So it kind of creates a bit more willingness. Anyway, I don't know if you want to add anything, Abbie, or...
No, pretty much the same. And also just to emphasize that you're asking people to answer in their professional capacity. So you're not encouraging people to say anything that they wouldn't necessarily say at work and so on. But yeah, Charles is right. If the topic was more politically sensitive, it might become slightly more difficult. But if you ever want, sorry, yeah, you got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
I didn't know. I've just found the hand up button, so I needed to kind of have a go with it. Yeah, no, that would be great. Sorry, I'll try and lower my hand now. That would be great. I've had I'm not going to get into my personal project, over now. So I've had two different responses from two different councils. One very, yeah, with fantastic, that's great, we'll get on board, and another kind of, I think there's been, some not very good press about the council, and so real kind of concerns about how any reporting of findings might politically reflect on them. So that's what I was interested in. And yes, thank you. I have sort of gone back to them and talked about anonymity and those kind of things, and what it seemed was that they didn't really understand that would be a central part of the ethics process anyway. But as I say, I'm very early on in my study. It's a very personal question, but I might take you up, Abbie, on your offer to get in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I would really like to hear what Tim and Dominic's thoughts are on Irena's question. Maybe Tim, from an industrial policy perspective, what could central government be doing to devolve more powers to the regions? And Dominic, I guess, what would help you in your role, apart from a money tree and an infinite budget?
Is the answer more devolution? Yes. I think that's I think there's general recognition across economists now that more devolution is a good thing, that people in their local communities understand their local economies, their local structures, the local employment situations better than civil servants in Whitehall. I think there are fewer and fewer people would argue against that. But I go back to the last point I made about getting the right institutions. It feels to me, I'm not an expert on this, but it feels to me that the Greater Manchester Combined Authority works well. Similarly for the West Midlands. But having an economic unit, having a coherent economic unit, I think is quite important, and having political leadership is important. And both of those, the political leadership thing is a real hornet's nest because there are some local political communities that don't want an elected mayor, and asking a public that's quite weary of politicians, do you want another layer of politician, doesn't normally come back with a positive answer as well. So, there are big hurdles to actually making this happen. But I think the evidence shows that we would get better economic decision making if we devolved. Now, in terms of what central government can do, the current government has set up these agreements across these kind of negotiating agreements. I think there's one across social care, whereby there is collective bargaining across the industry rather than at the individual company level. I'm trying to remember what there's a name for the agreements. I can't remember off the top of my head what they are. But basically, this would be a negotiation that takes place across the whole of the social care industry, which is fragmented and hard for workers to bargain on their own. And depending on how that works, I think it could provide a model for bargaining across other areas. So, warehousing, for example, rather than individual warehouses or individual companies to be bargaining, there could be agreements across the piece. And you could, combining that with the European Framework Agreement on digitalisation, you could potentially envisage a negotiated agreement across warehousing that covers the introduction of digital technology in warehouses. I mean, that's something that's achievable, and you could put those two things together and make that happen. There would be a lot of political will would be necessary to make it happen. But I think, thinking creatively about how we use institutions to, raise the quality of jobs in sectors that are facing the introduction of digital technology is, it's not beyond the wit of humankind that we can do some stuff on this. That would be my response. Can I just ask, and I hope this question comes out as I mean it to come out. Can I ask Dominic if when Barnsley was developing its economic plan for the next 5 years, whether they consulted unions? And if they didn't, was that because it just didn't occur to them to do so, or unions didn't think that was their role, or was there, or perhaps they did consult unions? And I'd be curious to know how that went, if Dominic would be brave enough to answer that question. So.
That is a big question, Tim. I'll come back to that in a second, but okay. I'll answer the first question really shortly and succinctly. Really, devolution is a great thing. It's been fantastic. It's unlocked lots of opportunities, not just in Barnsley but across South Yorkshire, and there are lots of regional growth opportunities that we're shaping and big part of. So we look forward to not just the outcomes of those, but also the kind of opportunities that more powers and crucially more funding provides. The only caveat being that you can give all the powers, but ultimately people have to use them. We've been really lucky in Barnsley to have political stability for the past 30 years. That we've got all-out elections now, so that could change. But we've got a leader who understands the power of economic growth, the opportunities that it brings to residents, and has essentially been taking the political risks required to, mentioned earlier, unlock land on the Greenbelt, to build, for example, this digital campus on a very popular car park. So that's allowed us to kind of have that ambition, that drive to do things within the kind of existing framework and powers. So it's all well and good having them, but you have to use them. To answer your question directly, Tim, I'll be totally honest, we could have done a lot more, talked to a lot more people. In this case, we didn't, but we do have representation, not from the unions on the Inclusive Economy Board, but we have a real kind of mix of voices. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It was just literally to kind of not move fast, but to make sure that we would kind of do that. So we had a really good reference group of quite small, 4 or 5 people with a real range of voices. And what we would like to think is that, particularly in our third mission around empowering communities to thrive, where we think about kind of those left behind, that we'd like to pick up on, we do pick up on some of the issues that would have been raised. So there's more to do on that, and we would love to build relations with all partners really going forward.
Thanks a lot. I had a slightly more conceptual question because oh, sorry, Gabriella, do you want to jump in first before I?
Maybe before your new question, Steve,
Yeah.
thank you. Now, I just wanted to go back to Irina's very important question about the role of the state, which I think immobilizes also what Tim was saying before about agenda and priority settings and the kind of sectoral approach that has been established in the industrial growth strategy. So, as we know, the industrial growth strategy is actually favoring kind of high-tech manufacturing, the kind of green sector, alongside digital and financial sectors, and partly health. And of course, like from our point of view, warehousing falls through the cracks. And I think it was incredibly important that Tim highlighted how the so-called everyday or foundational economy has been forgotten. And this is where the role of the state comes in terms of the ability then for local governments to not only tap into existing funding, but also prioritize certain areas rather than others. And I think that that role of the foundational economy needs to be brought back in. So in terms of the role of the state, we have almost like discursive, ideological influence, but then also that is often reproduced then at the local government because of the constraints that come from the top. And it's fascinating to see how even like Leeds City Council has revised the inclusive growth strategy 3 times. And now, in the last version of it, 100,000 jobs are meant to be created. Guess what? Exactly in the same sectors that the industrial growth strategy established. So there is a kind of recognition about this discussion about talking about the value and the social value of jobs in the foundational economy. But then in practice, when you see where funding is going, unfortunately, this is not happening. So I do agree very much with Tim that like visibilizing again the everyday economy is very important. That I also wonder whether Tim Dominic also had some more thoughts on this. And then finally, if we have time, maybe Tim can also comment on what he sees as the opportunities from the new employment rights bill in terms of unionizing some of these sectors. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks. There's lots there. I was just going to briefly add some thoughts. Tim mentioned a couple of times Danny Roderick's work, and it just occurred to me, a decade back, he was, I guess, at that point, most or widely known for his idea of premature deindustrialization, and that we were going through deindustrialization in the advanced economies, but even that developing economies were also experiencing this, and that basically this was a big problem. And the root of that is it's a structuralist one. He argues that services are just intrinsically less amenable to year-on-year productivity gains than the manufacturing sector. And so he was quite pessimistic back then. But it does seem that in his more recent work, he's been talking about this notion of productivism in the services sector, as Tim mentioned, and the possibilities for actually achieving, year-on-year productivity gains in these sort of foundational economy areas. So it would be fascinating to hear what, some real world applications of these questions, really, what you're actually finding in the warehousing sector. Are there these consistent productivity gains taking place? What's the role of the local state in them? You touched on that quite a bit, but it would be great to hear a bit more about the evidence on that. And then do you feel optimistic that this switch from manufacturing to services isn't necessarily a death sentence for growth and productivity, but instead can potentially be an opportunity? So I think it's great to have this work because it tests out these big conceptual questions, in granular detail and in practice, and gives us evidence for A, whether that's possible, and then B, what role the state at the local level should play in that. So there's lots there as well, I think, from Gabriella's comment. So I guess we can go back and do one more round of the presenters and the discussants.
Dominic has his hand up, so let him go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up some really big questions there. some that are more relevant for us and some that are more relevant for national government. But I think there's a really important point around the productivity of that foundational economy. It makes up a huge chunk of local economies across the country. And just wanted to say that that could provide opportunities as part of the Tech Town initiative. And the business support, that makes such a huge difference to individual businesses, and it's on us to kind of show the benefit of that. So, for example, hairdressers that are taking bookings, possibly in future might have done that through a Facebook page. They can do that now with AI, and it can save them time and do things. It's the little things like that that can build up that productivity and efficiency. And we're really keen in Barnsley to make sure that a lot of our smaller manufacturing businesses are able to innovate and use technology in a way that essentially allows them to survive. Because we know that there's going to be more and more changes across that. So that's why we've tried to capture that in our mission, particularly that second one around future proofing, helping them where they can and plugging them into that business support officer offer and making them compete essentially for the next years to come. But I think there's been some important questions raised about the National Industrial Strategy, about the IS8 as they call the priority sectors, and what that has in terms of implications for the foundation economy. So certainly we're quite concerned that none of the IS8 sectors feature in Barnsley. So what does that bring for us? So how do we plug into those? Yes, there could be something around supply chains, but how are you able to kind of plug that in? So there's lots of food for thought. But we're essentially trying to focus on the regional and local elements of that where we can.
Thanks. Go ahead, Charles, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So the point about sort of productivity and jobs, yeah. I mean, Dominic has already spoken to this about in terms of some quite concrete things that local authorities are doing. I think one of the things that struck us is about how, there's been huge productivity growth in warehousing since COVID. We haven't particularly seen job loss, but what we have seen is huge productivity growth without a corresponding increase in number of people employed. So a lot of firms have been kind of retaining similar levels of staffing, but handling much, much more throughput. Now, that obviously, the risk there, I guess, is that in future, if the kind of industry or sort of e-commerce, for example, winds down a little bit, it could pave the way for kind of job losses in future. Because yes, undoubtedly, firms are able to handle much higher volumes with fewer people, and I think that's really why that's one of the kind of reasons why the strategies we're trying to talk about are so important. Because at the moment, a lot of local authorities, a lot of people within local authorities don't necessarily have a good, clear view of what the future holds for warehousing, so they're not able to sort of engage in that kind of future planning. Because it's hard to get them to sort of talk about what they're going to be doing in the future. What are they investing in? Why? What does it mean for workers? So in addition to that, we also know that there are sort of hard technological limits on certain types of task. So when you look in a very granular level, you'll see there's certain things where warehousing employers will say, actually, no, we're very unlikely to automate that. And this could be granular things like opening boxes, taking things on and off trucks. There's certain things that actually technology theoretically can do, but it can't do it as reliably, or the efficiency gains don't really make it worth paying for the technology over a human. So it's also important that local authorities know about those kind of roles and say, okay, what jobs are likely to stay? And again, how can we prepare for that? How can we adjust training systems for that? And that's very difficult without, again, more engagement with warehousing firms. So that's why I think we're starting to talk about, potentially more conditionality. And as Tim has been saying, more union involvement. How could, if we have a warehouse where there isn't union representation, clearly there are in a number of warehouses, but there's a lot where there isn't. How can we have real oversight of what that employer's technological plans are, what it could mean for jobs, what jobs are likely to be under threat, what jobs are likely to stay, without requirements for companies to have more in-depth dialogue with local authorities and without bringing trade unions into that. So yeah, that seems really important, that unions are centralised more in these discussions as well. Anyway, yeah, so it's slightly garbled response, but hopefully there's something that makes sense in there.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add anything?
Tim, I don't know if you wanted to finish this with some employment rights bill reflections.
Well,
no pressure.
No, it's okay. I mean, I haven't been looking at the employment rights bill in great detail. It's most people in the trade union movement have, but I haven't particularly. But there are. I'm looking at the gov.uk. I mean, there are. In amongst a whole gamut of things that it introduces, it includes, for example, introducing a duty for employers to inform workers of their right to join a union, introducing new rights and protections for trade union representatives. So, it would strike me that this is an opportunity to increase union membership. And I think that's what the government intends it to be or hopes it to be, as part of its role. So I think it's good news. I think the fact that some anti-union employers have been so hostile to it suggests that it is good news. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so hostile to it. So in that sense, I think it's positive. But I mean, can I end by saying something else? Because we talk about productivity and we talk about jobs, and we increase productivity often if we replace a human by a machine. But it's a kind of a rather depressing debate to have in a way. I would like to see a government commitment to good jobs. I would like to see. We used to have a government commitment to full employment, in the Keynesian years, and a government employment to, good full employment was considered to be a high and stable level of employment. It wasn't full. There's always a bit of churn, but a government commitment to full employment, a government commitment to good jobs, that doesn't seem to me to be, an impossible utopianist dream. Other governments around the world do it. And somebody, I think it might have been Joseph Stiglitz once said, imagine if we put our innovative effort, instead of trying to create machines that replace worker jobs, we put that into dealing with climate change. What different outcomes might we have? So, I think calling on government to support good jobs. And so, for example, if government's going to spend money on option A or option B, and option B is job richer than option A, then it should be a major part of the decision making process that they go for the option that is job rich. That wouldn't seem to me to be a particularly difficult or onerous requirement of government. So I'll kind of leave you with that thought, really.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Well, hopefully you can join me in thanking the authors of the report and our two discussants for this brilliant discussion today. This is part of our Digit Debate series. We'll take a break over the summer, but these events will be back in the autumn. So hopefully you can follow the links through in the chat and join us again sometime. There's a poll on your screen. It would be great if you could fill that in before you leave. But otherwise, thanks again very much to everybody for coming along, and see you again soon.
Yep.